Momentum is building at an international level. France has said it plans to recognise Palestinian statehood in September. The UK says it will join the major power unless Israel meets certain conditions. Canada too has announced its own plans for recognition with a different set of conditions attached. And now the Australian government is weighing in, taking another step towards recognising Palestine in a joint statement with 14 other countries. But the Prime Minister has stopped short of a full commitment, despite calls for the government to go even further. Today I'm talking to Deputy Editor Patrick Keneally and Head of Newsroom Mike Ticher on the building pressure pushing Australia towards recognising Palestinian statehood. Good morning, Patrick.
Morning, Reged.
And good morning, Mike.
Hi, Reged.
Look, the Australian government and the Prime Minister Anthony Albanese, their position on the Israel-Gaza war has evolved over time as the conflict has gone on. What has brought the Prime Minister to this point now?
So I remember we talked about this a while ago at a point previously where the government's rhetoric changed when Penny Wong said the Australian government saw recognition of the Palestinian state not necessarily as the end point of a peace process, but as something that might contribute to it. That was a while ago. Since then, obviously, things have moved on a lot, specifically on the ground in Gaza with all the absolutely horrific news reporting and images that have come out of there over the past months and even more so in the past weeks. And then in the very recent days, we've seen France first going to announcing that it would recognise the Palestinian state without many preconditions at the UN General Assembly meeting in September. UK followed fairly quickly after that with some conditions, but conditions that were unlikely to be met by Israel, saying it also would recognise a Palestinian state. And then on Thursday, Canada kind of fell in line with those two countries as well. Now, most countries in the world do already recognise a Palestinian state, about 3/4 of them, but mostly not countries that normally Australia allies with on these issues and considers, the kind of countries that we'd look to for a lead on these things.
Heavy hitters, superpower.
Yeah. Obviously, the US is a huge exception to that, but now that European countries or others are also considering it, that has certainly contributed to the modification of language, at the very least from the Australian government, and it feels like we're heading towards recognition, but they won't say when or what exactly are the criteria that would have to be met for them to come to that decision.
Yeah, I think that's right. And look, earlier this week as well, Australia signed a letter along with 14 other countries as part of this, what's called the New York Call, and that was published by the French Foreign Minister. And it said that signatories to that letter have either already recognised or expressed the willingness or the positive consideration of countries to recognise the state of Palestine. So it was sort of a halfway step, indicating that this was something that was under active consideration, which is a change of policy because, as Mike mentioned, recognition of Palestinian statehood for Australia and many other Western countries has always been part of what they called a final status question, which would be considered as part of a settlement in the region, along with things like the status of Jerusalem, the borders of Israel and Palestine, the question of the right of return of refugees. It was always considered something that would be addressed as part of future peace talks. Now we're bringing it forward. And different countries have suggested different reasons for that. The UK has sort of made it as a suggestion they will do it if Israel does not allow an appropriate amount of aid to get into the country to deal with the starvation and hunger crisis that's going on in there. So different countries have sort of had little bits of increments on there. Also, it's not uniform across the West. As Mike mentioned, there's a lot of countries that have already recognised, in fact, the majority of countries in the UN have already recognised Palestinian statehood. But countries like Ireland, Norway and Spain recognised Palestine back in 2024. So there's been a lot of movement across different countries at different points over the last 2 years since the attacks of October 7.
It's kind of a bit odd in a way because all these things are being tied to political developments, basically, this question of recognition. The criteria for recognition are fairly clear, whether it has defined boundaries, permanent population, a government, and the capacity to enter into international relations. And if anything, those things have been in place in past years to a greater extent than they are now. Like the government of the Palestinian territories is currently split between the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank and Hamas in Gaza, and to the extent to which Hamas has any control over what's happening in Gaza, or very extremely limited control, it's obviously been massively compromised by the invasion and the war. And the same goes for the West Bank to some extent because of the settlements. Those things and the border question is quite unclear and becoming more unclear thanks to settlements, the ability of the Palestinian Authority to exert control over that region. So the sort of objective criteria that are supposed to be the measure of what a state is have not become more clear.
I think there's so much frustration with what's going on. Settlement expansion continues in the West Bank. Obviously the starvation and hunger crisis that's going on in Gaza. I think a lot of countries are seeing this as a way to disrupt and push these things along rather than in recognition of what the facts are on the ground. Yeah.
And Israel hasn't welcomed any of these moves.
No, obviously Israel have said, and the US has joined in on this chorus of saying, oh, you're rewarding Hamas. Now, I don't know to what extent you can actually reward Hamas when they're basically destroyed militarily in Gaza. Their allies in Hezbollah and so on have also been pretty much defeated militarily. Gaza's in ruins. People are starving. Really, to what extent is this a kind of reward, as they term it?
There's been a lot of confusion about what recognition means, because one of the conditions that some states are putting on it is that Hamas, for example, should have no role in the future government of a Palestinian state. And that's completely blurring the boundaries between what it means to recognise a state and what it means to recognise the legitimate government of a state. I mean, those two things are not the same things. There are lots of governments around the world whose governments we profoundly disapprove of. You can think of Afghanistan, Myanmar, Russia, dozens of governments where we think we would much prefer them to have a different government. That doesn't mean we don't recognise the state as a state. It's become this really blurry argument about what recognition means, where we're tying the state of Palestine to what its future government should be, in some cases whether it should be demilitarized, all these kind of questions that really, in pure terms, should not have an influence on whether we think it is a state or not.
What about the messages that the UK, France, even Australia are trying to send to the US, to Donald Trump? Are they trying to bring him on board because the US is such an important lever?
I don't think it's very likely that that's going to work if that is what they're intending. I think it's just generally designed to increase pressure on Israel. They're doing what they can within the limited influence of all those countries. The US obviously has by far the biggest influence over Israel. There are things, those other things those countries could be doing, which they're not doing. In terms of influence in the US, I mean, how do you influence Donald Trump? No one, I don't think, has come up with a great answer to that.
There's been attempts. Keir Starmer, the British Prime Minister, spoke to Donald Trump about their decision. And initially Trump was receptive. He didn't criticise it. He later obviously came out and repeated those lines about rewarding Hamas and was critical of it. So there have been attempts. I just don't think it's realistic to think that Trump or the US administration is going to change tack on this.
So let's bring it back home in terms of influencing Labor. Anthony Albanese, the Prime Minister, Jim Chalmers has said, look, recognition of a Palestinian state is a matter of when, not if. But where is the pressure coming from for the Labor government?
Look, I think there's been a lot of pressure from both within the Labor caucus. Certainly there was discussion of it. During the Labor's meeting on Tuesday, there were questions to the Prime Minister about the timeline, what was holding him back and so on. But there's also been pressure at the kind of grassroots and the rank and file of the Labor Party around Australia, state levels. It's going to be discussed this weekend at the Victorian ALP conference. There's also been pressure from outside the party, independents, minor parties, the Greens, obviously have all been critical of Labor's position on this. It was an issue at the last federal election. Labor was under pressure in many of its Western Sydney seats. So there's a multitude of areas in which it's under pressure on this issue.
But also just the general public mood. I think everyone's seen the pictures, read what's happening in Gaza. I don't think that's fake, that people are responding to that. Politicians are also responding to that in quite a human way. they are under political pressure, as it would be on many international issues, but I don't think we should be cynical about the fact that they are actually looking at stuff that's coming across their TV screens and in the papers and on websites and feeling the need to do something. However, people may see what they are doing as inadequate so far. But there's just an actual human impulse to feel like not just sit idly by and watch this horror unfolding in front of our eyes.
What about the coalition? Because they haven't been as unequivocal. Are they going to make an issue out of this should the government move to recognise a Palestinian state?
In some ways, I think the coalition is denying the reality of what's happening on the ground here. We had James Paterson, a coalition frontbencher, on Radio National this week, who was asked repeatedly if there was starvation affecting the people of Gaza, and he basically avoided the question. He recognised that there was, quote, real suffering going on in Gaza, but repeatedly refused to use the word starvation. I think they are looking more and more like they're being left behind on this. As we mentioned before, the recognition of Palestinian statehood has always been bipartisan in that it's seen as something which will happen in the future. Labor is slightly changing on this, inching forward towards perhaps making an announcement about it in September at the UN. But so far the coalition is showing no indication of wanting to change their position on this.
Yeah, and Dan Ticher was also on the radio earlier in the week, not just saying there was no starvation in Gaza, but accusing Hamas of stealing aid under the previous provisions of aid being supplied through the UN and so on, basically parroting lines from the Israeli government, which I think kind of strikes a discordant note for a lot of Australians now when they're seeing the evidence in front of their own eyes from TV reports and online. But certainly I think certainly recognition of statehood is going to be a bridge too far for many in the coalition anytime soon. So if the government does take that step, which it seems like they are heading towards, that is going to be a breach of the bipartisan position, and they obviously will have to take that into account in their deliberations about whether or when they do that. But to be honest, I don't think they have a lot to lose on that in terms of the public reaction to that. I feel like, if anything, the pressure is more on the government to move quicker and faster and to do more on this situation rather than less.
I just also wanted to say, just on the issue of hunger and starvation within Gaza, this is not something that I think is really in contention. There's been, the coalition has refused to enter into that. James Paterson saying his position was, I'm not on the ground, so I can't make an assessment, which is ridiculous. You wouldn't say that no one ever said that about the Ethiopian famine or, any of the other multiple famines that have happened throughout the, last, few decades. The UN has been on the record saying that there's, maybe 100,000 people in urgent need of food, suffering the effects of malnutrition. I think it is a cop-out to say I'm not there, I can't tell, when there's been so many reports documenting just the volume of aid that is not entering into the Gaza. You can count the number of trucks that are going in. It's not a kind of academic exercise. You can look at the facts on the ground from reliable sources.
Anthony Albanese referred to this specifically on Insiders last Sunday when he talked about, for the first time, saying that Israel had breached international law by preventing food aid from being delivered inside Gaza, which it had announced in March, which, you might think raises the question, well, why has it taken until late July for the Australian government to say that's a breach of international law? But I think they will be thinking more about people who want them to do more rather than the coalition's position, which seems to be them wanting to do less.
Given everything you've described and the real misery we're seeing in Gaza, what else can the Australian government do to try and bring an end to this conflict?
There's large protests planned for this weekend, including protesters in Sydney who are planning a march across the Sydney Harbour Bridge. There's a fight obviously going on between the New South Wales State Government, police and the protest groups over whether that will go ahead. We're recording on Thursday. We don't know the answer to that yet. But they're calling for things like trade sanctions with Israel. They're calling for Australia to take part in international legal cases against Israel. They're calling for a ban on weapons exports to Israel. Now, Anthony Albanese's position on this has been that he says we don't export any weapons to Israel. That is contested at the moment. He also says that we're not a major player in the Middle East, so whatever we do, we're a middle power, and that I think his position and Penny Wong's position has been that we are better off doing these things in a multilateral forums where we band together with other Western nations to take these on, and it has more impact. So that's the government's position on that. It's not the only thing they have done, though. Joining this letter, they sanctioned 2 right-wing Israeli ministers over their activities and statements about settlement expansion in the West Bank. So there have been other actions from the government, but it's nowhere near what people are calling for at the moment.
And I think that argument that we can't do anything by ourselves, we're not really a player, increasingly doesn't wash, I think, because now we are basically doing things, not literally in concert. I'm sure discussions are going on, but people are not coming out and making joint statements about this, but each country individually is coming out and saying the same, more or less the same thing. So what else are you waiting for,
The situation just seems like the prospects have never been worse for some kind of 2-state solution, which I think is also the reason why people are saying, well, we're not just going to sit around and wait for the situation for the circumstances to be right. Yeah.
Perhaps extremely optimistically, sometimes a crisis also gives you an opportunity to move things on. And to some extent, things have moved on to the extent that people have changed their positions. Whether that has an actual impact on events on the ground is another matter. But maybe we can end on that at least tiny optimistic note that events change, people are changing their views. The diplomatic situation internationally is changing quite quickly, but we don't know what effect that's going to have in a practical sense for the people in Gaza and the other Palestinian territories.
Okay, it's time for what we can't get out of our heads. Patrick.
Something a bit more fun, I guess, after a very heavy topic we've just been through. I really enjoyed listening to and voting in Triple J's Hottest 100 songs, Australian songs of all time. I didn't agree with the number 1.
INXS's Never Tear Us Apart is officially Australia's favourite song.
But it was just a communal moment. Like, we had friends over, we, drunk too much wine, sung along with all the songs. It was fantastic. You don't get many of those communal moments anymore where everybody's watching or listening to the same thing. Somebody else was talking about walking through the streets of the inner city, and you could hear people with their windows open, partying, listening to this song. It was a great moment. It was a great idea. It does kind of show the value of a national public broadcaster at its best, I think.
Wait, who did you vote for?
I think the best one was Paul Kelly's How to Make Gravy, which is an absolutely iconic Australian song, and everyone can sing along to it. I think.
It should have won. That should have won.
Yeah.
It's like not even in my top 20 Paul Kelly songs, that song.
Mike, what is yours?
Look, surprisingly, maybe for some people, I want to talk about Gwyneth Paltrow. We ran a quite long article, which I found myself reading right to the end this week, about 10 things that you might learn from reading a new book that's come out, a unauthorised biography about her that's just come out. I think the most interesting thing, there's a lot of fun and quite a lot of serious stuff in there, but the most interesting thing I thought that came out of it for me was how far ahead of the curve she was on wellness and what has become the phenomenon of wellness on TikTok and Instagram particularly. I mean, not in a good way.
Not in a good way.
She was ahead of the curve, but I'm not trying to say she's
there was some very dubious products.
There were, but she kind of understood how to make herself into a brand and how to talk to other people about that stuff in a very effective way that has been extremely damaging to our culture.
Has been, but she was an influencer before influencers were a thing.
She was, and it's also, as the article points out, it's kind of played into distrust of science and the whole, anti-vax movement and all the things that welled up during COVID that have played in a part into the whole Trump phenomenon in America. I'm not saying she's responsible for Donald Trump in any way, or at least only in a very small way. But I found that kind of drawing those threads was really interesting.
Patrick and Mike, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Reged.
Thanks a lot, Reged.